The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out, to spend that time with me, I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
Policy Center panel discussion, trust issues examining declining confidence in our political institutions, in partnership with the National Capital Area Political Science Association. I'm Michael Thorning. I'm Director of Structural Democracy here at BPC, and we're very pleased to be partnering with NCAPSA on what I think is our shared aim to bring scholarship to the fore of our debates and dialogue about the future of our democracy. Today's topic, I think, needs little introduction or stage setting. I think we can stipulate that Americans' confidence in their institutions is low and has been trending downward. But just yesterday, Gallup released some polling on an issue very near and dear to BPC's heart, which is the debt limit, and showed that the public has fairly low confidence in our leaders' ability to resolve that before we default on our debt. Somewhere between 1/3 and 40% of Americans have confidence in President Biden, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and our congressional leaders in the House and Senate, both Republicans and Democrats. So today we start from a place where I think we understand that Americans' confidence is low, but we'd like to examine more why that confidence has declined in recent decades, what the consequences of that decline are, and hopefully we can end on somewhat of an optimistic note and discuss what some of the solutions and remedies may be for that declining trust. So now I will turn it over to Jordan Tama, who is the president of the National Capital Area Political Science Association and a professor at the American University. Take it away, Jordan.
Thanks so much, Michael. And on behalf of the National Capital Area Political Science Association, it's a pleasure to partner with the Bipartisan Policy Center on this event. And I'm going to introduce our terrific set of panelists and then open up the conversation with them. So we're joined today by Holly Russin-Gilman. She's a senior fellow in the Political Reform Program at New America and an affiliate fellow at the Harvard Ash Center. Carl Levan is a professor in the School of International Service at American University. Yuval Levin is Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies and the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. And Nadzea Shutava is Research Manager at the Partnership for Public Service. And to start things off, Nadzea, I'm going to turn to you. The Partnership for Public Service has surveyed the American public on their attitudes regarding the federal government. And I thought it'd be helpful to, as a baseline for the conversation, get on the table some, data about how the public actually views the federal government. What do the survey results tell us about how the public sees the federal government, and how do levels of American public trust in government institutions compare to levels of trust in other countries in government institutions? That's something you've also looked at.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. Yes, the Partnership for Public Service conducted 2 nationally representative public surveys so far in 2021 and in 2022. Both these times we received fairly similar results for the overall level of trust in the federal government. And according to our latest data, only about 1/3 of people in the United States say they trust the federal government. So that would be 35%, compared to 46% who indicate that they do not trust the federal government. Now, we did want to dig a little deeper and asked a number of different questions around trust, trying to get at the issue from different angles, and found out that more people feel that the federal government has a negative impact on the United States than positive one. So 53% of people indicated that the United States, in their opinion, has negative impact on the country. And only 1/3 of our respondents believe that the government helps people like them. We also wanted to look at some components of the federal government and really try to find some positive trends in the data. And we also found out that people have somewhat more favorable views of local government and state government. So in terms of state government, 53% of our respondents feel favorably towards it, and 58% of our respondents feel favorably towards local government. Also, we looked at different federal agencies, and 13 of the ones that we asked about were viewed mostly positively. Only one of them, actually 12, were viewed positively, and one sort of in the middle. And then one of the great examples is National Park Service, which is viewed positively by 84% of Americans. This is a great number. I don't think that Americans agree on anything as much as they do on their favorability of National Park Service. And Social Security Administration was viewed favorably by 69% of our respondents. We also looked specifically at the opinions of civil servants. We also found out that generally they're viewed positively. 62% of people indicated positive views of civil servants. And most of them are seen competent. Americans agree that civil servants are doing public service, and also a lot of our respondents agree that they are hard workers. So some of the positive trends there that we really wanted to focus on. Now, when it comes to the second part of your question, Jordan, on the comparison of where United States stand when we compare some international data, some of the most robust research in that area is done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. They conducted a poll in 22 countries in 2021, where they compared different questions around trust, drivers of trust, and unfortunately, the United States did not officially participate in that poll, but we at the partnership were very curious about being able to compare some of the data. So we actually asked 4 of the same questions that we are asked in the OECD poll. And according to that imperfect but still somewhat possible comparison, we found out that if we look at the overall trust in government, the United States would be placed 14th out of 21 countries, with, again, repeating the 35% of the public trust in the federal government overall. And then on the other questions, we would rank in the lower third or lower fourth out of 23 or 22 countries, because depending on the question, not all of them were asked of all of the countries. So 33% of the US respondents said that it's likely that the federal government would improve a badly working service. And about a third have confidence that the federal government would adopt an innovative idea. And more than half, 54%, said that it's likely that they would easily find information about administrative procedures, but still all of this question would place us 18, 17, 16 out of 23, 22 countries. So we see that overall the picture is somewhat grim, with some pieces and parts of positivity that we could find if we really dig deeper.
Thank you, Nadia. That's a very helpful set of data to provide a baseline for the conversation. Now I want to turn to thinking about why there are high levels of distrust in political institutions. Yuval, you've written eloquently about the importance of trust in a variety of institutions, government institutions, as well as other kinds of institutions. Why is trust in institutions important generally? Trust in various kinds of institutions, but political institutions specifically. And what are the effects that can occur when trust in institutions is low? What are the problems created by low levels of trust in institutions?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jordan, and thanks to BPC for hosting this. I think it's a tremendously important question because, in a sense, the answer to what do things look like when we have no trust is look around. It looks like a politics that doesn't function well, a politics that struggles to do the basic things. I think in some ways trust is the secret ingredient in the recipe for a free society. The secret ingredient, both in the sense that it's essential and in the sense that it is a little hard to see and understand. Trust in public institutions, the sense that they are there to serve you, that they'll do what they say, that they pursue the interest of the society at large, is absolutely critical for a free society, because in a free society, the public ultimately makes decisions, and it's not, no one has the power to push anyone else around. And so for any of us to essentially submit ourselves to the power of a democratic majority, we have to believe that there are structures and institutions that on the one hand are there to protect us from abuses by that majority power, and on the other hand are there to ensure that government power is used in our interest and in the common interest. I think it's that concept of our, of us, of the first person plural that is really made possible by trust, that allows you to think of yourself as part of a larger whole that is our society. And the ability to do that in a society where you don't govern, where you're just one person, where maybe you're part of a political minority at a given time, requires an enormous amount of trust. And so I think one way to understand the moment we're living in is that it is a time when people have lost the ability, or when too many people have, the ability to think about our country in the first person plural, and to say us and we when we talk about public problems, when we talk about people in power. And instead, we have a sense that the institutions of American life are there for other people. They're there for them. They serve them and not me. And there is a kind of disillusionment. There is a sense of cynicism, conspiracism, a sense of isolation, a sense of alienation. All of these things that we consider to be the kind of mysterious symptoms of the social crisis that we are now living through in America. A lot of them are driven by an underlying loss of trust. So that in thinking about how to address these problems, before we think about the nature of the kinds of institutional reforms we need, before we think about systems and structures, we really have to think about this notion of trust, of what it is, how it can be created, how it is spent and used, and how it's lost. And so I think we're forced to think about this invisible force that makes life in a free society possible now. And that requires us to take up all kinds of complicated questions that, when things are going well, Americans would rather ignore. We'd rather think of ourselves as just free individuals doing whatever we want. And we are that in some respects, but that's possible because we live in a society where trust makes a lot of the background work of governance possible. And when that fails, we see a moment like the one we're living through now.
Okay. Holly, I want to turn to you. You've written about innovative models for fostering civic engagement and trust in institutions. We'll dive into that in a bit, but I'd love to have you first just frame how you see the importance of trust in institutions. Why should we care about trust in public institutions and political institutions specifically?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for hosting to the center. This is an extraordinary group. I'm already learning a lot. I think a lot of what you've all said resonates with me. I want to point our attention to an op-ed that the Surgeon General wrote last week talking about the increased risk of premature death associated with social disconnection is comparable to smoking daily and may even be greater than the risk associated with obesity. For me, this was really striking when we think about why we need to care about trust in our society, right? It's not only when we think about the body politic and our institutional structures, but this is actually harming individuals. The loneliness epidemic, the violence, the othering that is have trust in the system. It has all of these negative externalities for our communities. And so we really need to think about what it looks like to reimagine, reinvest in our civic and social infrastructure, the people, the places, the programs that bring us together. Because I think without doing that, we run the risk of, not being able to see people in our communities, right, as part of the same team, not being able to find those containers to work across difference to solve public challenges, and essentially leaving us both on the individual level and on the communal, society, the national level, ill-equipped to solve the largest problems of our society. So for me, when I think about why does the crisis of trust and legitimacy matter? It matters on the individual level. We're seeing the loneliness, the isolation, the hatred. We're seeing that being fueled. It matters on the local, national, state, federal level, because then there's an inability to believe in these institutions to solve the most challenging problems of the day, the kind that take real interdependence, the kind of problems that require us all coming together, moving towards a green economy, solving inequality, large scale problems that no individual can do. But when we are so atomized, when we are so lonely, when we are so angry, we're not creating any container, any underlying infrastructure upon which we can then solve these other issues. So it's not just a political challenge, the crisis of trust, it's also an individual and it's an existential challenge, right, for people in communities, but also for the country.
Hey, Carl, I'd like to get your thoughts on this question about why we should be concerned about high levels of distrust. You're an expert on political institutions in different countries, particularly Africa and the United States. From your standpoint, why should we care about trust in political institutions?
Thanks for the opportunity to participate and weigh in on this really important question. And also want to say I enjoy being a dues-paying member of the National Capital Area Political Science Association. So I think in the back of everybody's mind is, of course, political polarization, but I want to highlight a couple of other things that I think are also big macro level effects of low levels of trust that don't quite get enough attention. One is that it's cognitively exhausting for people. And this is one of the things that I think the Surgeon General's op-ed last week was getting at. And so if you don't trust the mainstream media, and if you don't trust the messaging from your politicians, this creates burdens on people to then go through their social media feed and try to figure out what's true and what's false and whom to trust. And that is exhausting. So it takes not only time, but it also has adverse effects on people's emotional well-being. And one of the things that political psychologists have been looking at for a few years now is how that then interferes with people's ability to make judgments about information. So in other words, these social disconnections are somehow linked to willingness to believe false information. And I think this is really an emerging and important field. The second thing is that I think with low trust, I think it changes the way conflict is resolved in society, and not just conflict by formal political institutions, but conflict among communities. And this is why the declining trust in the courts in the United States is so important and somewhat unusual historically. So now I think increasingly American citizens are looking at not just the Supreme Court, but the courts in general and saying, gosh, can I trust this decision? Do I know that self-interest has been removed and that the judges in these decisions are truly acting on their understanding of the law rather than some other hidden self-interest? And this is This is a very concerning problem, and there's still opportunity to correct that. And I hope that there's an opening for bipartisanship along those lines. A third area that I would emphasize is just sort of general sense of uncertainty about the predictability of institutions to behave as they're supposed to behave. And this gets layered on top of a fluctuating economy that we've experienced since 2008. And we are certainly in an unpredictable cycle right now, especially with a looming debt crisis over our head. And if I can sneak in, one or two other observations, highlighting some of the interesting findings from outside the United States. I've been looking at trust cross-nationally with my PhD student, James Bryan, across 59 different countries. And there are some really interesting regional differences. And one thing is that, for example, in Africa, which has experienced a fair amount of democratic stalling or even backsliding in some cases, the most untrusted category showing up in the Afrobarometer survey is the opposition party. So how is democracy going to advance? How are people going to be willing to change party and to hold the incumbent accountable or threaten to hold the incumbent party accountable if they're unwilling to trust the opposition party? This is really, a crisis, I think, for democracy. On the higher end, it was interesting that traditional rulers and chiefs are, tend to be among the most trusted, pretty high up there with local government, in fact. But we also, in my research and in my collaborations, I've also really wanted to take a moment to clarify different types of trust that I think we're talking about. On the one hand, we are talking about trust among people. In our field, it's and in sociology, we think of this as horizontal trust. And I've really been focused lately on these questions of vertical trust. And when we get to the questions about the drivers of distrust, hopefully I can talk a little bit more about that. But what we mean by vertical mistrust is where people place some sort of faith in institutions to act on their behalf or act on behalf of some public interest. And so this is what people do when they decide to vote for one member of Congress over another member of Congress. You're deferring judgment to that person because you believe they will take your interests to heart. And so there clearly are crises of these different types of trust. But one of the reasons why I've become particularly interested in that vertical trust is because I think the decline of trust in experts and expertise over the last 5 or 10 years is also really important. And in our research, as we've looked at different measures of distrust and expertise alongside distrust in political institutions, the alignment of those two things coming together is really concerning and something that we're trying to draw attention to.
We're going to move next to the question of why levels of distrust have been rising in recent years, what the drivers of distrust are. Before doing that, I want to note that anyone watching the discussion is very welcome to submit questions for the panelists. You can do this using the live chat on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag BPC Live. So please send in your questions. We're going to have time for questions from the audience toward the end of the hour. And for the panelists, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers to 2 minutes so we can get through a few more sets of questions and then turn it to the questions from the audience. So on drivers of distrust in political institutions, Yuval, I'd like to start with you. What do you see as the drivers of distrust in political institutions?
Well, thank you. And I want to pick up right where Carl left off, which is with that crucial question of vertical trust or trust in institutions, which has been the subject of my own academic work. There's obviously a vast literature in political science and in sociology that helps us to understand the nature of that kind of trust. But one way to very crudely and unfairly summarize it might be to say that we can think of trust along 2 axes. Trust is a function of evident competence on the one hand and evidence restraint on the other hand. Those are closely related, but they're not the same. Competence is simply the ability to do your core work well, whatever that work is. And certainly part of our loss of trust in elites and in institutions does come from a sense that people who make claims to competence in American life often can't back those up, that our elites maybe are not as competent as they claim to be. And in some ways, American life in the 21st century has offered us all too many illustrations of that cause for concern, whether that's in Iraq or the financial crisis or various kinds of welfare state incompetence or the public health expertise in the pandemic. You could say we've lived through a period where elites have earned some distrust, but I actually don't think that incompetence is the crucial force that's driving our loss of trust. I don't think contemporary elites are particularly incompetent in historical terms. And alongside those failures, we can also point to a lot of successes over the 21st century. We just don't tend to emphasize those in our public life. I think what we are really missing is the importance of evident restraint in building public trust. The sense not only that people will do what they say, but that people will not put their own interest ahead of mine, that there are things people won't do. If you ask yourself very often why you trust experts or why you trust elites, why you trust institutions, it's not just that they can do their job, but they will only do their job. Right? I trust an accountant, not just because she probably knows the tax laws a lot better than I do, I would hope so, but also because an accountant is somebody who would not sign their name to a lie, to a false statement. Maybe I trust a scientist because that's a person who, before they speak, what they say has been through some process, some formal professional process of verification that can assure me that what I'm hearing is true or as close to true as it can be. That's why you would trust a journalist. That's why you would trust really most professionals, is not just that they've learned some skills that you don't have, but that they're constrained by institutional constraints that can assure us that there are boundaries. There are things they will not do. I think when you look at the public opinion data about trust in institutions in American life now, what really stands out is that Americans have lost the sense that many professionals are constrained in this way, and instead have a sense that everybody is engaged in something other than their professional work, that everybody is political or everybody's drawn into cultural debates, and that you just can't trust that people are just doing what they're here to do, but instead they seem to be putting something else in front of that professional obligation. And one further factor here is that there's also a sense that a lot of our institutions now are not there to constrain the people in them, to empower them by bounding them, which is the ironic way in which our institutions actually do empower people within them, but that instead people are using institutions as platforms to elevate themselves, as platforms to build a following, to build their own brand. You see this in our politics, you see this in the corporate world. People have the feeling that every institution now is just a stage to stand on and yell about the issue of the day, that that's what the university is, that that's what the newspaper is, that that's what Congress is. Now, this isn't simply true. People who work in these institutions could tell you a lot of ways in which they're actually doing their important work and are very much bounded by them. But the public perception of the condition of American institutions is very focused now on a sense that the people with authority and power within those institutions are not doing their work, but instead are using them to perform. And that has had an enormous amount to do with the distinct loss of trust in 21st century America. One more thing I'd say, Americans are not a trusting people, broadly speaking. If you'd looked in on America at any point in the 19th century, you would also have found a lot of mistrust. But I think it's important to distinguish types of mistrust. And we are, I think, seeing a very distinct type of mistrust that is now built on this sense that American elites, however you define elites, are not engaged in the work that they are entrusted to do, but are engaged in building their own following. And that kind of mistrust has to be addressed in a particular way, and again, through evident restraint, by showing there are things you would not do. And that's not easy to do. I think it does require an understanding of what our institutions are for, how they work, and how, by constraining us, they can actually empower us. In that sense, I think all of us in the various institutions that we're part of in American life have a lot of work to do.
Holly, I want to get your perspective on this, and in particular, I'm curious to get your thoughts on a point that Nadzea made at the opening about levels of trust in state and local government being higher than levels of trust in the federal government. You've done a lot of work at different government levels, including state and local government. Does that kind of public attitude, greater confidence in state and local institutions, tell us something about why levels of distrust might be high for the federal government? Is there something there about institutions being more distanced from people that's going to increase levels of distrust? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. I do think I'm thinking here of sort of the Suzanne Mettler submerged state idea. I think often on the federal level, it's harder for individuals to see, okay, this is the result of government spending. Like, it was really interesting to hear about the research related to Social Security, which is sort of dollars that people receive in their lives. And so when I've seen a lot of data around, higher levels of trust on the local level, because it is more visible, it is more tangible, right? When I think about some of the places and communities where you can have those strengthened relationships with your electeds on the local level, there is a sense of accountability and there is a sense of feedback loops. I do think this sense of being disconnected from policies and the lack of tight feedback loops back to individuals is definitely one of the drivers we're seeing for these low levels. And on the state and local level, there are just more opportunities to be present. And I think the last few years in the United States, COVID, murders of George Floyd, you've seen local leaders being more responsive to their constituents, saying that we have to do more inclusive and equitable forms of civic engagement. The models of policy we've done in the past are not working. And so I think those are all contributing to people feeling on the local level like there is more accountability for their elected officials. Another driver, I think, when I, looking at the landscape holistically, I do think, thinking, of course, of, Putnam and Garrett and sort of the decline in civic associations, I do think that is a driver that we're seeing because people they're more atomized. They're in front of their phones, they're on social media, they're in their echo chambers. They're not actually meeting people who are different than them. They're not getting out, working with their neighbors. And I think that also is fueling this sense of mistrust in these systems. And so I think there is more of an opportunity on the local level to kind of reknit some of this fabric, and there are opportunities to rebuild some of those feedback loops. I do think now with, historic federal investments in communities, this is another opportunity to showcase to people in communities, here is how your institutions can work for you. Here are dollars that can improve your lives, that can address historic racism and inequities, that can really try to make people's lives better in their communities. But I think we have to kind of connect the dots for people. And then third, I think finally, thinking of Don Kettle and others here, the interweaving of the public and the private, the state in the 21st century is a massive apparatus. And there are so many ways that the social sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector is working with the public sector. And this can lead to a lot of confusion, I think just naturally so, about what institutions are doing what. And so when you overlay that with a system that already has a lot of non-transparency in how things are done, has a lot of ossified systems in place, you really don't have that feedback to understand sort of where is any institution accountable to me as an individual. And so I think all of these are working kind of in a perfect storm to accelerate these levels of low trust.
Hey, Carl, I want to turn to you now, and you've been doing some interesting research on how psychological distress can contribute to mistrust in institutions. Could you tell us about those research findings?
Sure. So one of my collaborators is a clinical psychologist. Another one of my collaborators is a health economist. And one thing that we set out to do about 2 years ago, and we're still pushing out the results in our data, is that we wanted to look at trust observationally and not attitudinally. So up until now, we've really primarily been talking about surveys and public opinion polls. And these are instruments that are sampled to be representative at the national level. So giving a national level portrait and maybe being able to compare different groups over time. What we set out to do was to create a data set across 3,000 American counties in order to figure out where and why different communities are more or less trusting. So this means that we had to use what we call in social sciences proxies, which are sort of substitute measures for a direct observation. And we found a few measures that were commonly used by economists, by sociologists, and by political scientists. So for example, we looked at census self-response rates, and we also looked at the tax compliance rates, comparing people's self-reported income to the IRS with their self-reported income to the Census Bureau. And of course, there's a gap, because if you mislead the IRS, there are potential consequences. And there's a lot of discussion among economists about what those terms mean. And some of the interesting things that we found, just to sort of jump ahead to the top lines, is that we're able to take these different measures of mistrust alongside some of the COVID-19 contexts, such as vaccine hesitancy, rates of mask wearing at the county level, and interestingly, flu vaccination rate, using that as sort of a measure to see if the pandemic itself was politicized, or if there is some sort of mistrust in overall scientific expertise. That's not scientific knowledge, that's not scientific literacy, but do you trust scientific expertise? And so we were very interested to see if mistrust in political institutions moved alongside that mistrust in scientific expertise. And in most instances, it does. But one of the things that was interesting was there are very different experiences among different racial and ethnic demographics. Some of this is no surprise to people who've been following the public opinion survey data. So for example, very high rates of mistrust among Black Americans, very high rates of mistrust among Native Americans. Very interestingly, this turns around very quickly and dramatically during the pandemic, which we find interesting. And then very high rates of trust among Asian Americans, exactly the opposite of every other census-defined ethnic and racial category. So then we took a look at that along a CDC variable that takes a look at the number of days that people report as mental health days where they're unable to perform their usual daily duties. And this turns out to be pretty highly correlated with tax compliance, with COVID hesitancy, and with a range of things. And what we found so interesting, and which is what I think drew us to the Bipartisan Policy Center today, is that many of these effects cut across partisan identification. And we look at voting as well as party registration. And so what we think this means is that there is a public health component to rebuilding America's trust and building these kinds of communities that Holly and others have been talking about. And that, I think, very much aligns with what the Surgeon General was trying to get us to think about. So thanks for that opportunity to explain that, Jordan.
Great. And Nadzia, I'm going to turn to you in a moment. I just want to, again, note that if you're watching the conversation, you can submit your questions using the live chat on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. Nadzia, I'm going to turn to you as part of pivoting also to the next topic that I want to focus on, which will be possible solutions or ways to restore trust in institutions, looking for some hope perhaps. What would you add to the points that have been made about drivers of mistrust, and do you see from the research that you've done and that you're familiar with opportunities for restoring trust or fostering more trust in government institutions? And then I'll turn to the others for their thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of the points that were already made were excellent, and it's interesting how a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to reasons behind mistrust bleeds into the conversation on opportunities and how we could potentially look into remedies. In terms of the reasons behind public mistrust, one major consideration here is that our research was based on public opinion polls. So I want to bring our attention to the fact that sometimes people just don't know why they feel a certain way. And we can ask them how they feel, and they would indicate that. But then in terms of reasons, with a lot of complex issues such as trust in our institutions, it's sometimes very hard to tell. But we did attempt to take a closer look at the potential reasons, and we asked a battery of questions on the positive attributes of the government and more on negative attributes to see whether people would agree or disagree with those. So for example, on the positive side, we asked whether people believe that the federal government keeps them safe, whether the federal government serves my community, serves my essential needs, accountable, transparent, listens to the public. And for all of the positive questions, we found that most of the public disagreed with the positive attributes. Some of the most striking results we received for the federal government listens to the public. So 73% of people disagreed that the federal government listens to the public. So very low ratings of responsiveness. Then the federal government is transparent. 70% of people disagreed with that. So the majority of the public believes that the federal government is not transparent. And also more than half of our respondents disagreed that the federal government serves their community. So these are some of the factors that we need to look closer into when we are considering the reasons behind mistrust. And then the opposite was also true. So when we suggested some negative attributes with the federal government, most of the public agreed with the negatives. So federal government is too bureaucratic, 70% agreed with that. Federal government is wasteful, again, 70% agreed with that. Corrupt, 67% agreed with that. So we could definitely see lots of negative inclinations in how the public responded to those questions. Now, in terms of opportunities, I think I would like to bring our attention back to one of the points that Yuval made in talking about the reasons behind mistrust. When he mentioned that some of the work that the government does is invisible, or the public is actually not aware of the everyday work of, for example, public servants. So I mentioned in the very beginning that we saw that the public is generally more favorable of public servants, for example. And when doing our research, we also started with some qualitative studies. So we conducted focus groups when we talked to people about how they feel again, about different components of the federal government. And we saw that specifically showing the everyday work of public servants, we actually demonstrated a video where one of the public servants was talking about his day-to-day routine, day-to-day work, and the results of his work. A lot of the public were very responsive to that. And some of the people we talked to in our focus groups indicated that they were not aware that, oh, wow, this is so impressive, this is so great. And the shift in their opinion was almost visible right there in the moment. Now, of course, that would take longitudinal studies and more diverse groups of people looking into that, but we definitely see an opportunity in highlighting the everyday work of government officials and highlighting that not all of it is about big politics, and a lot of the work the government does is connected to our everyday lives, and a lot of their work serves our day-to-day needs. I think that's one of the major things that we wanted to highlight as an organization. And personally, I believe that is an important factor of mistrust and an opportunity for improvement as well.
Okay, I'm going to now go to Holly and then Yuval and Carl and ask each of you to briefly highlight the one thing that you think could be done that would be most valuable in restoring trust or bolstering trust in institutions, and a bunch of questions have been coming in from the audience. So then we'll have a little time left to take a few of those audience questions. Holly, over to you.
Great, only one. Okay, I think over one, if I had to umbrella it, it would be sort of democratic experimentation. So sometimes I call it co-governance models. There's pick your language du jour, but the basic idea is to inject experimentation into our democracy. we have a very shallow, anemic sense of democracy right now. You vote every 2 to 4 years, if that. We know the turnout rates are very low. You give money. In my conception, this is a much more robust conception of democracy where people are much more engaged in day-to-day governance. So I'm thinking here of a suite of innovations and experiments that I've studied with my colleagues at New America and at Herbert Ash Center, looking at everything from participatory budgeting to citizen assemblies, to people's assemblies, to people coming together and reimagining what their park bench looks like. I can't tell you how many stories begin like that and then lead to a new office being created, such as in Lansing, Michigan, their office really focused on civic engagement and the arts. So in a nutshell, I think we really need much more experimentation with how we think about engaging residents as co-creators in a way that can genuinely build civic voice and civic power. We've never had a functioning multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. None of our peers have done it really well. It's a huge opportunity, I think, to try to get it right as a country, to try to come together across difference, to try to invest in the civic and social infrastructure that can help us get there, and to build what I call hooks and levers into decision makers. And so this is not only engaging civil society and the business community and the nonprofit sector, but actually engaging everyday people, the very people we're talking about in this panel who feel so disaffected from these institutions of governance, finding ways to really engage them in thoughtful, meaningful ways. And this requires really being thoughtful about how we design it, right? This is not about opening everything up to everyone to engage, but narrowing the aperture, having very structured, facilitated, moderated engagements, thinking about childcare accessibility, all of these things that we don't have time to get into right now, but designing engagement in a real thoughtful way with inclusivity front and center and showing that, the public sector can work for people.
Great. Yuval, what's the one thing that could most have the greatest impact in restoring or bolstering trust in public institutions?
Yeah. Well, obviously there's no single bullet here, but if we need to find a single bullet, I think that I would begin from the point I got at earlier, that a lot of our mistrust is a function of people's sense that people around them are not restrained. And there is, I think, there's a lot of powerful evidence in the public opinion surveys on this, that evidence of restraint is a powerful source of trust. And it's a little counterintuitive. Saying, this is all I know, I don't know more than this, is actually a way to get people to believe what you say. Saying, I'd love to do this, but I don't have the authority to do this, is a way to help people trust what you're doing within the authority you do have. The danger in that is that it's a way of talking about what other people should do to build trust. And I think it's important for us to all talk about what we could do, not just people with power, but all of us, all Americans. And to me, that a place to start there is to think about how institutions constrain us and to ask ourselves a simple question when we face a moment of decision in our lives. To ask ourselves, given the role that I have here, how should I behave? Not just what do I want, not just what am I after, how do I want to seem, or what do I want people to think of me, but given the role that I have as a worker or an employer, as a parent or a neighbor or a teacher or president of the United States, given that role, what should I do here? Because a lot of times when we find ourselves losing trust, it takes the form of asking ourselves, how could that person do that? He's the president, he's a priest, whatever it is. It's a failure of obligation and responsibility that should have been obvious if you took account of the particular role you have in a particular moment in the life of our society. And I think trying to remind ourselves of that, and again, not just folding our arms and saying, boy, other people should really be a lot more responsible, but looking for ways that all of us, wherever we are, could be more responsible and therefore could help build trust in the institutions that we're part of, because everybody has some role to play in the life of some institution in American life. And we could all do a better job of making those institutions more trustworthy.
Excellent. Carl, briefly, what would be the one thing you would recommend for bolstering trust?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jordan. That's a tough question. I think one thing we need to do is to acknowledge that there are empirical differences across the experiences of different communities in the United States. And this means that there needs to be tailored narratives and different strategies for different communities. I mean, I think this is one of the things that really comes through in the radically different experiences of, say, Native Americans to Asian Americans. At the same time, we need to find some sort of common denominator for these communities, something that is that brings together around a common cause. And this is part of our emerging interest, I think, in these public health questions, is that once you look outside of the pandemic specifically, that there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation and concern on rural America's health crisis. So, for example, in our research, when we threw in the interaction of rural America with that mental health variable that I mentioned, the results did really unpredictable things. And I think that's partly because the traditional partisan story of mistrust, which is otherwise very robust, really starts to break down around these other things that people really, really care about. So I think the task of people like us and the task of politicians is to find those issues such as public health, or perhaps even in the foreign policy realm, where people can come together and to explain these shared challenges to these different communities in ways that is meaningful to them.
Okay, great. So we've got less than 10 minutes left. We've got a lot of questions. We certainly can't get to all of them. I'm going to read a few questions that I think are especially interesting and give each of the panelists a moment to respond to any question that they would like to take a stab at, briefly in our remaining time. So there were a couple of questions that I'm going to group together that were along the lines of whether government in its current form and practices is really worthy of trust. So one person asked, shouldn't we be talking about trustworthiness rather than trust? Government may be concerned about whether citizens trust them, but citizens need to judge whether government can be trusted. And in a similar vein, someone else asked, don't we need to reform political systems to minimize career self-interest, party and donor interest over the national interest, catering to base voters instead of all voters as the key to building trust? So that's one set of concerns. Someone else from the audience asked whether the problem that's manifesting as trust is really a problem of polarization. People are cynical, this person said, and compromise is no longer a value. If trust requires your side winning 100%, can we really improve trust? So is this really just a problem of polarization? And then another question that I think is quite interesting, someone asked, stories are more impactful than statistics. The media has highlighted trust violations in academia, the courts, the government, pharma, et cetera. How do we overcome this? So, in other words, there are a lot of stories of bad behavior by public figures or institutions. How can, that kind of storytelling of bad behavior be countered? So I'm going to give each of you a minute max, be as brief as you can to respond to any of those questions that you might want to take a quick stab at. Holly.
Those are a lot of really good questions. People really liked, what we just heard from our fellow panelists, including this idea of the public servant. So can we make it more about the people and the individuals and less about these institutions? So I think, again, there's no panacea. But when I hear these questions, what I hear is this idea there's a monolith, right? There's the government. There's a big thing that's out there and we don't understand it. And there's the media, and the media is fueling this distrust of the government. Well, can we break it down, right? I mean, Carl, I think that idea around some issues like public health or foreign policy, where we can kind of find new narratives, makes a lot of sense to me. But really, I think if we could have more of those kind of videos that Nadia mentioned around, what do people actually do in government? And going back to the local level, I think this is why I think starting on the local level and maybe thinking about horizontal scale and thinking about how we find ways to connect with, our local people in our parks and rec department, local transportation people, local bureaucrats, electeds, going all the way up and trying to understand sort of what are some of the career people, the motivations, even if you look at on the federal government, right? We have our career, we have our foreign service, and we have our political. Maybe we need to showcase some of these other narratives around the people who have been in government, 50 years across so many different political administrations and what drives their work, and really showcasing that. That seems to me a really promising, at least one avenue to this sort of very hairy set of questions, because otherwise we get stuck in these large monoliths, and then of course it's going to seem, unwieldy. So I think that could be one way in.
Okay, great. Nadzea, any thoughts in response to those questions or closing thoughts in less than a minute?
Absolutely. Well, for the fear of sounding like an ad for the work that the Partnership for Public Service does, we actually have a YouTube channel where we do highlight the everyday work of public servants. We have a Service to America medals. It's an event where we highlight the work, where we give out recognition to the people who have been doing great work in the government in the previous year. So some of it is out there already, but of course, as noted in some of the questions and in some of our responses, is that the predominant narrative is of course highlighting the negatives. So how to counter that is for more organizations to join in the work of the Partnership for Public Service, and to join in on that work of highlighting the daily work. So that's really, again, I believe, a promising avenue here. In terms of trustworthiness, I also wanted to acknowledge that excellent question. We think about it a lot. So there is a big difference between what the government actually does and the perception of the government and the perception that the people have of what it does. Again, and bring us to highlighting and breaking down and bringing the public closer to the everyday work of the government and the public servants. Love the point that Holly made on personalization. So breaking down institutions and bringing it to personal level and making sure that people know that there are people just like them who work at the government.
Great. Carl, very briefly, 30 seconds or less, any closing thoughts or comments?
Sure. I think we need to really rethink the educational experience of young people. I know there's, some conversations about expanding civic education. If it's anything like the civic education that I had in middle school, then I'm not sure that's going to work. But I think one of the things that people get out of a renewed emphasis on education is new sets of tools for judgment. And so you've all mentioned the question of competence and incompetence. And when I'm thinking about judgment, I'm thinking that people have tools to make decisions and to evaluate, and can perhaps even do so weighing that with their own ethical values. And so it's not knowledge-based, it's more skills-based, and those skills can be related to your own ethical values. And when people have a more enriched experience to live their life as democratic citizens that way, there's greater opportunities to connect each other, there's greater incentives to understand each other, and this is the path to a more robust democracy, I think.
Okay, great. And Yuval, very briefly, 30 seconds or less, any last thoughts?
Well, I very much associate myself with what's been said here, and have learned a lot. Thank you for it. I think maybe one question that has not been taken up is the first question about incentives and trustworthiness. And I do think it's important to see that the concerns we're raising should, on the one hand, point to a change of attitudes or thinking differently about the sources of attitudes. They do also need to point to institutional reforms. There are ways in which the forms of our institutions do not now engender trust. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what would incentives look like that motivate people with power and authority in our society to be more trustworthy? And to recognize that the problem often is a problem of trustworthiness. It's not that the public won't trust its leaders, but that they don't work hard enough to be trustworthy. And that does require thinking about incentives, thinking about institutional structures, which is hard work and can be dull work, but is absolutely essential work for the kind of issues we're talking about.
Great. Well, thank you to the panelists for such thoughtful comments. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and for your excellent questions. Thank you to Michael Thorning and the Bipartisan Policy Center for partnering with the National Capital Area Political Science Association on this event. Certainly, this is not going to be the last conversation on this topic, and we look forward to continuing this discussion about trust in institutions and other fora. Thank you.